Committee on Oversight and Government Reform will come to order in pursuant to Committee Rule 5B and House Rule 11-2H4. Chair announces that he may postpone further proceedings today on any question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote on the yeas and nays is ordered. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Our first and only item for consideration today is House Resolution 737, condemning and censuring John A. Koskinen, the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service. And the clerk will designate the resolution.
House Resolution 737, resolution condemning and censuring John A. Koskinen, the Commissioner of Internal Revenue. Whereas the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform issued a subpoena to John A. Koskinen, Commissioner.
I ask unanimous consent that the resolution be considered as read and open for amendment at any time. Without objection, so ordered. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes to explain the resolution. Complying with the subpoena is mandatory. It's not optional. Truthfully testifying before Congress is also mandatory. When a senior executive branch official doesn't fulfill the core duties of ensuring compliance with a congressional subpoena and testifying truthfully to Congress, there must be repercussions. House Resolution 737, as introduced, is a necessary repercussion for IRS Commissioner John Koskinen. Mr. Koskinen's misconduct deserves condemnation and censure from the Congress. The resolution also makes clear Mr. Koskinen should resign. If he doesn't, the President should remove him, and that Mr. Koskinen forfeits his pension. While many in this committee are familiar with Mr. Koskinen's failings, I want to briefly revisit them. First of all, Mr. Koskinen failed to testify truthfully before Congress. I want to focus on statements he made to Congress in June of 2014 when he came before us to explain why the IRS could not produce thousands of Lois Lerner's emails. At that point in time, a subpoena for those emails was in place since August of 2013. There was another subpoena that was issued in February of 2014. On June 20th of 2014, Mr. Koskinen said, and I quote, "Since the start of this investigation, every email has been preserved, nothing has been lost, nothing has been destroyed," end quote. That was not true. The investigation began in May of 2012. Yet the Inspector General found the IRS destroyed 422 backup tapes containing as many as 24,000 emails to and from Ms. Lerner on March 4th of 2014. That's the date in which we know there was destruction. Also on June 20th of 2014, Mr. Koskinen told Congress, quote, "We confirmed that backup tapes from 2011 no longer existed because they've been recycled pursuant to IRS normal policy," end quote. That was not true either. The backup tapes were intact until March 4th of 2014, almost 2 years after the congressional investigation began. These false statements were even more disturbing because the IRS knew in February of 2014 there was a problem with her emails, Ms. Lois Lerner's emails. On February 2nd, 2014, Super Bowl Sunday, Kate Duvall, counsel to the Commissioner, realized that some of Lois Lerner's emails were missing from the IRS production to Congress. Ms. Duvall was essentially managing the IRS's response to Congress. So on the next day, February 3rd, Monday, Ms. Duvall told her colleagues at the IRS about the problem she found. She talked to the information technology people. She talked to the people in the Office of Chief Counsel. She talked to the Deputy Associate Chief Counsel, Thomas Kane. And by the next day, February 4th, Thomas Kane figured out Lois Lerner's hard drive crashed in 2011, which is why many of her emails were evidently missing. So the IRS knew in early February of 2014 there was a problem with her emails. And Mr. Koskinen told us he personally knew about Ms. Lerner's hard drive crash and missing emails in mid-April. And still Mr. Koskinen failed to take basic steps to try to locate the documents. According to the Inspector General, he failed to look in 5 of the 6 places Ms. Lerner's emails could have existed: backup tapes, her BlackBerry, the server, the backup server, and her laptop that was on loan. In fact, the IRS barely looked for the missing emails at all, nor did Mr. Koskinen notify Congress of the problem. But the IRS did notify the Treasury Department and the White House that Ms. Lerner's emails were missing. And then Mr. Koskinen waited, and he waited some more, and he waited until June 13th when the IRS finally told Congress by burying a couple of sentences in the 5th page of an attachment to a letter to the Senate Finance Committee. That triggered a number of hearings in Congress, and Mr. Koskinen came up to testify and explained what happened. And then he lied to us under oath. Mr. Koskinen told yet another lie a month later on July 23rd of 2014. He was asked what was meant by the word confirmed. If you remember earlier, he said that they had confirmed this. He said, quote, "Confirmed means that somebody went back and looked and made sure that, in fact, any backup tapes that had existed had been recycled," end quote. That was completely and totally false. Nobody at the IRS went back and confirmed the tapes were destroyed. If they had, in fact, if they had done so after they learned that some of Ms. Lerner's emails were missing in early February, they could have actually found the backup tapes before they were destroyed. Remember, it was the Inspector General that only took 15 days for the Inspector General's team to find some backup tapes in West Virginia. The IRS was telling us they had spent $18 to $20 million, 250 people to get this job done. They couldn't find anything, but the Inspector General, with a handful of people in 15 days, did find them. Tim Camus, Deputy Inspector of Investigations at TIGTA, the Inspector General, summed it up by testifying, and I say, in quote, he said, quote, "The best we can determine through the investigation, they simply didn't look for those emails. So for the over 1,000 emails that we found on the backup tapes, we found them because we looked for them," end quote. It is important to note Mr. Koskinen has never made an attempt to clarify or amend any of his prior statements, that being through today here in 2016. Last year, the Government Accountability Office audited whether the IRS had implemented changes to prevent targeting from happening again. Remember, it was the President who stood up in the White House and told us all that he was going to get somebody new in there to work hand in hand with Congress to try to make sure this never ever happened again. But again, a more recent GAO report found nothing has changed. The environment for targeting still exists. GAO found there's still a risk that the IRS, quote, "could select organizations for examinations in an unfair manner based on an organization's religious, educational, political, or other views," end quote. Mr. Koskinen, the President's turnaround artist, has done nothing to prevent the IRS from targeting other Americans for their political beliefs. Mr. Koskinen was confirmed in December of 2013. His term does not expire when President Obama leaves office. He will continue to lead the agency based on that Senate confirmation until November of 2017 unless we act. Because of the actions of Mr. Koskinen, Americans will never know the truth about how and why their First Amendment rights were violated. For these reasons, Mr. Koskinen should face the ultimate repercussion and be impeached. Toward that end, censure is a helpful first step. We owe it to the American people to ensure their government officials are held accountable for misconduct. When there's a duly issued subpoena, you have to comply with it. When you come to Congress, you must testify truthfully. If you find later that there has been a mistake in your testimony, you need to come and explain that and correct the record. None of that happened with Mr. Koskinen. The situation is getting worse. It's not getting better. And that's why I would urge my colleagues to support House Resolution 737, condemning and censuring Mr. Koskinen. We'll now recognize the Ranking Member, Mr. Cummings, for his statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me start off by saying this. Every single member of this committee know that I have the utmost respect for you, and you know I consider you a friend. You also know, and I think, that I try at every opportunity to work with you in a bipartisan manner. Life is short. And I try to make sure that whatever we do, that we are effective and efficient at doing it. Part of that effectiveness and efficiency certainly goes to integrity. Yesterday, we hit an amazing milestone here on the Oversight Committee. We signed our 600th bipartisan letter since you and I have been serving as chairman and ranking member together. We send a lot of letters, but this has to be a record for this committee in a single Congress, and we're not finished yet. And it is a sea change from how things used to be around here. We've done serious investigations, such as the Secret Service investigation. We have looked just yesterday at the Park Service, where we are in agreement on much of our conclusions from that hearing and our investigations. We've also worked on a bipartisan legislation like the landmark FOIA Improvement Act, and House passed this week and sent it to the President, as well as a postal reform bill, which we will be unveiling today. Simply, I want to be effective and efficient in whatever I do, and I want this committee to be the same. So it really sincerely bothers and it pains me when we press forward with bogus issues like the one we are discussing today. Mr. Chairman, I say this as your friend, and you are completely and totally wrong on this one. The Department of Justice disagrees with you. The Republican Inspector General disagrees with you. The distinguished senator from Utah, who you know well, Senator Hatch, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, disagrees with you. There was no politically motivated targeting at IRS. There was no lying to Congress. There was no obstruction of justice. It simply didn't happen. After 3 years and more than $20 million spent, it is finally time to put these baseless conspiracy theories to rest. This resolution is a waste of time. It's going nowhere. It has no practical effect. And as respectfully as I can say it, it's time to give up on this one. It is now undermining the credibility and integrity of the committee and the work we do. Our committee is at its best when we work together on broad, productive reforms. I went to the House floor on Monday and praised you for your leadership on proactive legislation. That's what the American people want us to do. I think that that's one of the reasons why, when they don't see us doing productive things, they become so frustrated. And that is the kind of work we should be doing. John Koshinen is an honorable man. This 76-year-old gentleman came out of retirement to take on a difficult and thankless job. I cannot imagine any member of this committee willing to take on that job under those circumstances. The actions that occurred at IRS happened before Commissioner Koshinen even arrived. He's testified before our committee more often than any other agency had over the past 3 years. And he's answered question after question about all of the allegations of this resolution. Your core accusation against the Commissioner is that he was deceitful and that he misled the Congress. But you completely disregard the difference between a misstatement and a lie. You know, whenever I'm talking to my staff, Mr. Chairman, I tell them, don't call anybody a liar, because it's something that will go to their grave with them. It'll be written in the obituary. You ignore the fact that the Commissioner testified before us based on what he knew at the time. You suggest this distinction does not matter, but it does. As a case in point, I will be offering an amendment today to correct basic errors and inaccuracies in this censure resolution. There are a number of them. Mr. Chairman, I want to make clear that I'm not suggesting that you deceived the House when you included these inaccuracies in this resolution. I'm not alleging that you were dishonest. I recognize that you were likely relying on others for information. The same is true of Commissioner Koskinen. We'll also be offering a second amendment to recognize the findings of the Republican Inspector General of the IRS, Russell George. Mr. George identified no political targeting of any group, no order to destroy any emails, no obstruction of any investigation. I didn't say that. Mr. George, the Republican-appointed IG, said that. Republicans may want to ignore these findings, but they're right here in black and white. Finally, Mr. Chairman, let me close by making one final observation. On the committee's official website, there is a section called Getting Results, quote unquote. It lists 20 government employees you have called on to resign or be fired. Commissioner Koskinen's name is on that list with a quote, TBD, end of quote, next to it. Creating a hit list to knock off federal officials is not something to be proud of. Publicly defaming a public servant who came out of retirement to take the helm of an agency in turmoil is not a positive result. It is a travesty. We can and we should be proud of the bipartisan, proactive reforms we worked on together and will continue to work on, as we will do this afternoon with regard to the postal reform. And so I hope we can return to focusing on those issues that have the potential to deliver real results to the people who sent us here. One of the things that I say to my personal staff at the end of every week is, what did you deliver? What did you deliver beyond a speech? What did you deliver to the people who sent us here? And so I'm hoping that we will resolve this, and with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I appreciate the sincerity and the working relationship that we do have. And while we do see some things differently, I think the majority of the time we do come together, and I appreciate your comments to that regard. Does any other member wish to speak on the resolution? Now we're ready to start the amendment process. Are there any amendments to the resolution?
Chairman, I have an amendment.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.Res. 737, offered by Mr. Cummings of Maryland.
The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, is recognized for 5 minutes to explain the amendment. And without objection, the amendment is considered as read.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, unfortunately, this censure resolution is riddled with factual inaccuracies. It makes assertions that are just flat wrong. And this amendment is intended to remove those inaccuracies. As I've said to the Chairman, if we are going to vote on a censure resolution taking the pension away from Mr. Koskinen, I want to make sure that whatever we're voting on is accurate. There are 3 errors in particular that this amendment would remove. First, paragraph 10 of the resolution inaccurately splices together 2 quotes from Commissioner Koskinen from completely different hearings as if he said them together. This creates an inaccurate impression and should have been corrected long ago. It's just wrong. Second, paragraph 11 of the resolution asserts that Commissioner Koskinen should be censured because he did not check Lois Lerner's BlackBerry. That's also wrong. The Inspector General took possession of Ms. Lerner's BlackBerry 6 months before Commissioner Koskinen was even sworn in. 6 months. Again, this statement is just inaccurate. It's wrong. Third, paragraph 6 of the resolution asserts that Commissioner Koskinen knew, and I quote, as early as February 2014, that Ms. Lerner's emails were missing and could not be produced to Congress. This is also just wrong. It's inaccurate. The committee has obtained no evidence that Commissioner Koskinen became aware in February of 2014. The Commissioner has testified repeatedly that he learned about Ms. Lerner's hard drive crash and loss of emails in April of 2014. So these are all statements that are just wrong. They are inaccurate, and they need to be corrected. Whether you support the resolution or oppose it, you should at least be able to agree to get the facts right. Mr. Chairman, I want to make crystal clear again that I do not believe you intentionally made these inaccurate statements. I don't believe you tried to deceive the committee or the House. I believe you thought that they were accurate at the time and that you relied on staff. I believe the same thing about Commissioner Koskinen. He's been honest with us. He told us what he knew at the time, and he relied on his staff, just like you did and just like I do. For all of these reasons, I urge all committee members to adopt this amendment. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. I'll now recognize myself to speak to the amendment. I will be offering an amendment to the amendment. The gentleman is correct in terms of the date that should be included in there with July 23rd. The quote is accurate, but the date, I would agree with you, should include the July 23rd, but the quote is accurate. As far as the BlackBerry component to it, I can make these comments when I give my amendment to the amendment, but this is based on the IRS having this in their possession, and so I would disagree with you on the adjustment of that. And then as it relates to as early as February 14th, that is what Mr. Koskinen has told us, and we know that he definitively had it by April. So, but I believe, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm not getting the quote exactly right, but Mr. Koskinen at one point had testified before Congress that when his counsel knew, he knew, and that happened to be in February of 2014. So I will be offering an amendment to the amendment to get to the accuracy of the July 23rd, but I would not concur with the other two portions of it, and with that, I'll yield back. Does any other member wish to speak on the amendment?
Well, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman, let me go first to Mr. Conley of Virginia. He's recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chair. I support the amendment of Mr. Cummings, and I associate myself with all of his remarks. This is my 8th year here in the Congress, and I have seen this committee do good work and not so good work. Today you're about to smear the name of an honorable man and a distinguished public servant. 76 years old, came out of retirement to try to straighten out an agency all of us were concerned about. We're going to make assertions about the truthfulness of his testimony before this committee on 6 occasions. As the ranking member indicates in this amendment, we didn't even get it right in many cases, splicing different comments to allow the impression that they all occurred at the same time in the same setting. We don't give him the benefit of the doubt. We're going to insist for ourselves in terms of accuracy. When you take away someone's good name, you pretty much take away everything they got. This is a difficult town, Washington, and Truman once said, if you want a friend here, get a dog. But surely we could just once put aside partisanship and respect the fact that an individual before us is doing his best. He did not deceive. He didn't mislead. He certainly did not lie to this committee. Those are very harsh judgments that I hope are never held up to members of this committee at some point in their future. We're about to do something that I think is dishonorable and damages the kind of comedy and bipartisanship I think, Mr. Chairman, you've genuinely tried to foster in your tenure as chairman. And we've tried to cooperate with you in that endeavor. This, however, will be seen, I think, as a black mark on the functioning of this committee and this Congress, and not worthy of our endeavor. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Chairman, the previous speaker said he didn't deceive. Like heck he didn't deceive. You're exactly right. The IRS knew in February of 2014 that Lerner's hard drive had crashed and they were missing emails. And they waited 4 months before they told Congress and the American people. And guess what happened in that interim? That's when 422 backup tapes were destroyed. So if they would have told us in February when they knew, maybe they wouldn't have destroyed the backup tapes and we would have access to those 24,000 emails, many of them probably Lois Lerner emails. We'd have access to that information, which would have helped in this investigation. That's what this is about. When you have, and he testified right there at that table, if our chief counsel knew, the IRS knew. Those are his words. So they knew in February, waited 4 months to tell us in page 5 of some letter they sent to the Senate Finance Committee. Are you kidding? Of course that's deception. You can't wait 4 months. When this is a central issue, something we're investigating, committees in Congress, several committees are investigating, you wait that long to tell us? That's ridiculous. It should stay in the censure resolution.
Will the gentleman yield?
Of course.
I would also add to that that the IRS informed the White House. The White House told the Department of Treasury, but the White House did not tell Congress. That's just the facts. And still to this day, Mr. Koskinen sticks with that story and did not correct the record. If we get a date wrong, we're going to correct it. That's the honorable right thing to do. But still to this day, Mr. Koskinen stands by his statements and comments. And
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
There's another thing that happened in that interim. His chief counsel knows in February, he doesn't tell Congress until June. They not only destroyed 422 backup tapes in that time frame, he testified in front of Congress 4 times in that time frame and didn't tell us. It's got to stay in. Thanks. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any other member? Yes, Mr. Cartwright of Pennsylvania is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I concur with the ranking member's remarks that we are having a bogus day here in the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. I'd like to speak in favor of his amendment. The censure resolution asserts that Commissioner Koskinen should resign and forfeit his position because he has not, quote, gone to great lengths, unquote, to retrieve Lois Lerner's emails. Specifically, it asserts that the Commissioner failed to search Ms. Lerner's BlackBerry, which has been touched on. On June 30, 2015, the IG issued a report on this issue. On page 19 of the report, it states, and I quote, TIGTA took possession of Lerner's BlackBerry on June 10, 2013, after she left the IRS. The problem is that Commissioner Koskinen was not confirmed by the Senate until December 20, 2013, and he wasn't sworn in until December 23, 2013. That was 6 months after the Inspector General took Ms. Lerner's BlackBerry. So the Inspector General took possession of Ms. Lerner's BlackBerry when she left the IRS 6 months before Commissioner Koskinen was ever sworn in and conducted its own forensic analysis. So that charge against him cannot have been correct. I assume it was just an oversight and an error on the part of the chairman, but when we say oversight in this committee, we don't mean this is the mistake committee. And I assume that the chairman would not want this kind of mistake to stand in the resolution. And I say that when we go about the serious and sober business of deciding whether to censure a man and put a black mark on his career for the rest of his life, dates matter. Every little detail matters. And I ask my colleagues to adopt this amendment. I yield back.
Does any other member wish to speak on this amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Sorry, Mr. Heiss of Georgia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I respect the views of our friends on the other side of the aisle. They certainly have a right to their opinion, but they don't have the right to change the facts. And we are dealing here with a situation where without question, a federal agency has unleashed its power to apply undue, improper, and politically motivated scrutiny against innocent Americans. And it's appalling. There should be no citizen in this country who fears an agency of the government, specifically something with the power of the IRS, which can destroy lives, as you know, just for people exercising their God-given and constitutionally protected rights of a certain political viewpoint. And yet that's exactly what's happened here. And, you know, obviously people are fearful of the IRS. In fact, I think recent polls have showed that fewer than a third of Americans trust the IRS. And that ultimately all comes down to leadership. John Koskinen was supposed to be the man appointed by the President to clean up this agency and to institute reform and transparency. And starting right here with this committee, he certainly has not done so. And I stand against this amendment as it's written, as things are written. It needs to stay that way, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Plaskett, is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to state my support for the amendment because the facts are important, and being meticulous about them is what I think we are all about. And I think that the chairman, in giving the dates at which the Commissioner Koskinen knew about this, that the chairman may be confusing what the IRS knew and him taking responsibility for the IRS in his statement as opposed to what he personally knew. And, you know, I think that in the enormous amount of questioning and hearings and evidence that's been presented, we also have the testimony, the sworn testimony of the Commissioner. And, you know, my good friend across the aisle, Mr. Jordan, was so kind enough to question him on July 23rd. And I just want the record to reflect what he testified to in that rigorous cross-examination that took place. Koskinen says, I did not know, quote, I did not know that there were emails lost. I personally didn't know, and that is what I am testifying about until the middle of April. When I testified, and I've said this before in several hearings, when I testified on March 26, I did not know that her emails were not recoverable. The gentleman, Mr. Jordan, states then, but this is your testimony right here. I am reading. This is John Koskinen's testimony. Koskinen says, right. Mr. Jordan says, in mid-March 2014 timeframe, we learned the data stored on her computer hard drive was determined to be unrecoverable. So that is certainly before the March 26 hearing and the April 8th hearing in front of the Senate Finance Committee. So you had two opportunities when you already know it is unrecoverable. That means you are not going to get what is there. Koskinen, no, I am sorry. I take, and I'm going to the earlier, I take responsibility for the agency. When I said in that, trying to report to the people what we knew, that is what the IRS knew. When you ask me specifically what did I know, I knew and I didn't know until April. If you told me now that Tom Kane said he knew in February, I would henceforth say that we, as the IRS, knew in February. I, myself, personally, did not know. When I testify, I tell you what I know, end quote. And so I think then, from the sworn testimony that we have, we cannot state the date that we have to put in here that he personally knew was not in March, was not in February, it was in April. And I think that the chairman would stand by that sworn testimony of Mr. Koskinen and make that record reflect that specifically. Now, if the gentleman would like to say that the IRS knew in February or April, he may do that. But to say that this man, this gentleman, who has come before you under sworn testimony and told you what he personally knew, that we have to take that unless we have evidence to controvert what he personally knew, that that date that he has given us in his sworn testimony should stand. And I yield back.
Thank the gentlewoman. Does any other member wish to speak on this amendment? The gentlewoman is from Ms. Lawrence of Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to speak in favor of this amendment. Paragraph 6 of the resolution states that the Commissioner knew as early as 2014 and that a substantial part of Lois Lerner's emails were missing and could not be produced to Congress. There is no evidence to support this statement. I thank my colleague, Ms. Plassig, for stating into the record again a sworn testimony. When did we as a committee become so godlike that we can say that a person is lying and a person is not, and that a person did receive the information even when we do not have data to support that? I appreciate the fact that if this body wants to say the IRS was aware, absolutely, let's move forward. But how do we say, without facts, that a person actually knew about this situation? My Republican colleagues may want to argue that the Commissioner learned about this early because it feeds into the position that they want to have, or what I can even call a conspiracy theory, and that the Commissioner intentionally withheld the information, was complicit in it, or even ordered the destruction of the backup tapes. But there's zero evidence to support this claim, none. None but a personal belief to support a theory that we cannot substantiate. The last time I checked, we are supposed to deal with facts. And if it had been the case that Inspector General would have uncovered it during his multi-year investigation, or the committee would have uncovered it during our exhaustive investigation, or the Department of Justice would have uncovered it. But the only reason this resolution includes language is because, for some reason, it's part of the plan to have this massive attack. But it's wrong, and it's inaccurate, and it needs to be corrected. I encourage all of my committee members, Republicans, Democrat, or those who are of other beliefs, to vote in favor of this amendment, because we, as a committee, should never, ever step outside of the fact that we're human and we're dealing with facts that are presented to us. And I yield back my time.
Thank the gentlewoman. Does any other member wish to speak on the amendment? If not, I have an amendment to the amendment. The clerk will designate that amendment.
Second-degree amendment offered by Mr. Chaffetz of Utah to the amendment offered by Mr. Cummings of Maryland to H.Res. 737.
Thank you. I'd now like to recognize myself for 5 minutes to explain the amendment. As I indicated, July 23rd should be included in there, and as you'll see, the amendment to the amendment includes that same portion. But I have moved to strike the first part of Mr. Cummings' amendment as well as the last part, and let me address each of those. Part of the testimony in the record here from Mr. Koskinen is when he says we, he's the Commissioner. I think that we is self-explanatory, that we means him as well. That's why we said as early as February 2014 and no later than. There is a range in there. I think we've been as clear as we possibly can. This is Mr. Koskinen's testimony. He says, quote, "In February, as I said, they briefed me that with the emails that they had pulled subject to the search terms, they were concerned that there was an issue with the date issues. I was not, advised not," and then got interrupted for a moment, "that there was a hard drive crash, but he knew that there was an issue, and that's what he testified to." I asked, as relates to the BlackBerry, the last part, I was the one that actually questioned Mr. Koskinen, and I said, did they look at her BlackBerry, her phone? Mr. Camus, who is the Inspector General, says, quote, "They did not," end quote. Again, that's why we included this. It is a definitive part of the record. I, again, agree with Mr. Cummings as to the middle part, if you will, the larger part, the middle part of his amendment, but I would disagree with the other two, and that's why I've offered an amendment that strikes those two portions of Mr. Cummings' amendment.
Would gentleman yield?
Yes.
I just want to make sure I understand your argument with regard to the BlackBerry.
Uh-huh.
TIGTA had the BlackBerry. They had taken it in June of 2013.
Correct.
And so you, according to this, you are saying that he should have done what? In other words, he doesn't, this is before he even gets sworn in. And the IG has the BlackBerry, but you want him to, what did you want him to do?
Well,
I'm just curious.
reclaiming my time.
Yeah, of course.
What Mr. Koskinen was testifying, as it says in our resolution, that the Internal Revenue Service, in fairness to Mr. Koskinen, he was not there when the targeting happened. The problem that I have with Mr. Koskinen, the reason that we believe that this censure, and I believe impeachment, is ultimately the right and just thing to do, is the way we have been misled, I believe lied to, because there has been no correction of the record. There has been an arrogance and a defiance that he is right on all points when the record does not reflect that. And we rely on the Inspector General, we rely on his own testimony. But as it says in our resolution, the Commissioner Koskinen testified that the Internal Revenue Service, I don't expect that he personally went and did it, but he is representing what the IRS did. And if he knew otherwise or came into facts later in his possession, he had a duty and obligation to correct the record and provide those to Congress. He managed to tell the White House, he managed to tell the Treasury Department, but he didn't tell us, and it was deceptive. And the record is clear that in terms of the BlackBerry, they was not checked, and it did go into the possession of TIGTA, but while they had it, remember, this investigation started years ago, and he bragged almost about the fact that he spent $18 to $20 million, 250 employees. They had this huge, massive dragnet out there trying to find that, but 5 of the 6 sources were not checked, and that included the BlackBerry.
Gentleman yield?
Sure.
So you're saying that he should have, although he was sworn in after TIGTA took possession of the BlackBerry, he should have gone to TIGTA and said, give me the BlackBerry? Is that what you're saying?
No, no, that's not what I'm saying. He was representing what the IRS did and did not do. And we find that to be inconsistent, untruthful, void of fact. That's why it's included. To yield back my, oh, go ahead, I'll yield one more time.
No, that's it.
Okay, I yield back my time. Does any other member wish to speak on my amendment to the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I just have
Recognize the gentleman
very
from Maryland,
much.
Mr. Cummings.
Chairman, I just want to, I want to enter into the record the report of the IG, and it's dated June 30th, 2015, and on the 3rd page, I just want to highlight this quote. However, the investigation did not uncover any evidence that the IRS and its employees purposely erased the tapes in order to conceal responsive emails from the Congress, the DOJ, or TIGTA. But going back to, end of quote, just going back, Mr. Chairman, we are placing Mr. Koskinen in a situation where you want him censured, you want him impeached, and at the same time, you're holding him responsible. And I know people make mistakes, staff make mistakes, or whatever. But again, I think that this is going a bit far with regard to this gentleman. And I've said enough.
Well, without objection, we will enter that report into the record. Without objection, so ordered. That will be entered into the record. If the gentleman will yield.
Of course.
The concern is that he came to our committee and testified that they had gone to such great lengths, is the word he kept. Gone to great lengths was the quote that he kept saying. And then went back and testified that he had confirmed confirmed that, in fact, these things said, and that's where, again, we get into this pattern of deception that I think, as the leader of that organization, is just intolerable.
Reclaiming my time.
And no doubt we disagree about this.
Okay. Just
Yes, of
reclaiming
course.
my time. Again, as I said in my opening statement, I think there's one thing to say somebody lied. It's just another thing, they may have been inaccurate based upon the knowledge that he had at that time. I just think that this is a bit much. Take a man's pension, ruin his reputation, and as I said, put a black mark on his life that will follow him straight on to his grave. With that, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does any other member wish to speak on the amendment to the amendment? If not, the question is now on the second-degree amendment offered by myself to the Cummings amendment. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. The ayes have it. The second-degree amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the amendment? If none, the question is now on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, as amended. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to as amended. Are there further amendments to the bill? Mr. Cartwright has an amendment, and the clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to HRES 737 offered by Mr. Cartwright of Pennsylvania.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Cartwright, is recognized for 5 minutes to explain the amendment, and without objection, the amendment is considered as read.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment strikes the current language in the resolution and replaces it with the exact verbatim findings of the Republican Inspector General of the IRS, Russell George, after his multi-year investigation. To reach these conclusions, the Inspector General's staff interviewed more than 100 witnesses, reviewed tens of thousands of documents, and even restored information from backup tapes. The Chairman's censure resolution contradicts these key findings made by Inspector General George. The Inspector General found that inappropriate screening criteria were used by the IRS, but he did not find that anyone at the IRS was politically motivated, and we all heard that testimony in this room. The Inspector General found no evidence that the Commissioner intentionally erased backup tapes, and we all heard that testimony in this room. The Inspector General found no evidence that the Commissioner tried to conceal information from the Congress, and we heard that testimony in this room. The Inspector General found no evidence that the Commissioner directed anyone else to destroy or conceal information from the Congress. We all heard that in this room. To the contrary, the Inspector General testified before this very committee on June 25, 2015, that the Commissioner was, and I quote, extraordinarily cooperative, unquote. The bottom line is that in order to vote for this censure resolution, you'd have to believe that Inspector General George is lying. So the censure resolution hinges on the theory that the Commissioner obstructed justice and concealed information, but the Inspector General found no evidence to support these claims. As has been mentioned, Senator Orrin Hatch, the Republican chairman of the Senate Committee on Finance, agreed with Republican Inspector General George. Senator Hatch stated that, quote, for the most part, he's been very cooperative with us, referring to Mr. Koskinen. My amendment strikes the unsubstantiated accusations in this censure resolution and replaces them with the Republican Inspector General's own conclusions, word for word. I urge committee members to adopt this amendment because it is based, in fact, and entirely on conclusions from the Republican Inspector General, Russell George. He interviewed more individuals than we did. He conducted an extremely thorough investigation, and if we mean our proceedings here in the Government and Oversight and Government Reform Committee, if we mean our proceedings here to be fact-based, and honoring the truth, we should use Mr. George's conclusions instead of the ones that we cook up here in the committee. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I'm in opposition to this amendment. I understand the points the gentleman tries to make about disparaging the character of the Inspector General. The fundamental flaw, though, I believe, in the argument in favor of this amendment is that the Department of Justice, the FBI, the Inspector General, none of them were looking at Mr. Koskinen's comments since the TIGTA report came out. They didn't do any investigation. They didn't conclude one way or the other. They didn't even look at it. It's something that was based solely on the testimony that came before this committee in which we have investigated. And so to dismiss the rest of those findings, we're concerned about Mr. Koskinen. When he came on board, there was a subpoena put in place in August of 2013. There was another subpoena in February after that that was put into place. They had a fiduciary responsibility to comply with that subpoena. Based on the testimony that he's been given, we find that to be false. Gentleman, I'm sure, wholeheartedly and sincerely disagrees with those conclusions. But I also want to make sure that based on previous statements that we're not trying to suggest that the IG in any way, shape, or form investigated Mr. Koskinen, because that simply did not happen. I now yield to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look at the last paragraph. The sense of the House of Representatives that Commissioner Koskinen is an honorable public servant. 3 preservation orders in place, 2 subpoenas in place, and he allows 422 backup tapes to be destroyed. He knows there's a problem with Ms. Lerner's hard drive and loss of emails and waits months to tell Congress, and yet here's the closing statement of Mr. Cartwright's resolution or amendment, excuse me, which says he's an honorable public servant and he's been extraordinarily cooperative with Congress. Are you kidding me? Destroying documents when there's 3 preservation orders in place, 1 by the IRS themselves, 2 subpoenas in place, and he's cooperative with Congress when he destroys the very documents we asked for in the subpoenas, and he's an honorable public servant and waits months to tell Congress when we're doing an investigation. This is ridiculous. And then how about the first page? No evidence the IRS employees were politically motivated in their creation and the use of inappropriate screening criteria. No evidence? How about the list that came out a week and a half ago? 426 groups that were targeted. Let me just read a few of the names. I'll start on the last page. I'll start with number 426, Yuba Sutter Tea Party Patriots. Number 425, Young Americans for Liberty Foundation. Number 424, Yorktown Alliance for Authentic Constitutionalism. How about 419, Wisconsin Faith and Freedom Coalition? How about 450, Wetumpka Tea Party, Western Slope Conservative Alliance, Western Liberty Network, West Suburban Patriots, We the People of Texas, We the People of New York, Wayne County Tea Party. Oh, we can go to the front page. Very first one, 10th Amendment Foundation. Number 2, 1776 Nation. Number 3, 1776 Tea Party. Four Corners Liberty Restoration. Number 4, 912 Lane County. 912 Project, Fort Worth. 912 Project of Burlington County. I mean, there wasn't, to say there was no evidence, we got the list. 426 of them. Almost every one of them is a conservative group. But we got an amendment in front of us that says there's no evidence the IRS employees were politically motivated. This is laughable. And then we got a resolution that says Mr. Koskinen was extraordinarily cooperative with Congress when he had 2 subpoenas and destroyed the very documents, or allowed to be destroyed the very documents we were seeking. If that's cooperation, Mr. Chairman, if there's any doubt, I'm against this amendment.
Reclaiming my time, I'll yield back. Does any other member wish to be heard on the amendment? Mr. Conley of Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gosh, I seem to recall this committee putting an awful lot of faith in the Republican Inspector General, Russell George, and he issued a report, and I want to quote from that report. He found, not the Democrats in this resolution, quote, no evidence that the IRS and its employees purposely erased the tapes in order to conceal responsive emails from the Congress, as well as DOJ or TIGTA. In that same report, the Republican Inspector General, on whom we relied so heavily, found, and I quote again, no evidence that the IRS employees involved intended to destroy data on the tapes or the hard drives in order to keep this information from Congress, the Department of Justice, or TIGTA. We've relied on the Inspector General when it was convenient, and I guess we want to disavow his report when it's not. Asserting things as facts when in fact they're not is the difference between being an investigative body that tries to pursue the truth and a star chamber. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Russell, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We seem to be making, with this amendment, much about the IG and Mr. George and whether or not his testimony uncovered that there was misleading going on. But I specifically, in the June 25th committee hearing, asked 3 distinct questions. I asked that since the IRS in testimony and letters had stated that it, quote, left no stone unturned to recover emails, given what had been brought forth to that date, I asked, was that true? The answer was that would not be true. Second question I asked, IRS officials testified that it was possible that Ms. Lerner's emails were recoverable on backup tapes, and were those tapes erased after July 2014? And then in the same month, July 2014, IRS officials testified to the Senate's Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee and OGR that it, quote, confirmed the emails were unrecoverable, end quote. And I asked, given that recoverable data still existed on the tapes, was the testimony true? And we were told in this committee that would not be true. And then I asked, in February 2015 testimony by Commissioner Koskinen, he declared that he had, quote, confirmed the emails were unrecoverable, end quote, and that there was, quote, no way to recover them, end quote. And I asked in this committee hearing, was that true? And the answer in this committee was that would not be true. So we can go and we can parse out certain things, but based upon what we heard from the Inspector General in this very room, that statements that had been made under testimony to both the House and the Senate would not be true with the knowledge of what they possessed at the time. That is why we have this problem. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Recognize the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we ought to ask ourselves, who is the public to believe? An intensely partisan committee known for its partisanship, or the Inspector General, the Department of Justice, even the FBI? The Inspector General, the Inspector General is usually the flagship of investigators, not this committee, appeared before this committee and found no wrongdoing. Do you remember the intense cross-examination under which he was put when he dared to find no wrongdoing? DOJ, the Department of Justice, did an intensive investigation. And their investigation went not only to Commissioner Koskinen, but they found, and here I quote, no evidence that any official involved in the handling of tax-exempt applications of or IRS leadership attempted to obstruct justice. That's investigation number 2, not a partisan investigation of a committee known for its partisanship. In a bipartisan briefing, the Department of Justice informed members of this committee and its staff that the Inspector General's office and the FBI agreed with the conclusions of the Department of Justice. Even the chairman has said he has confidence in FBI Director Comey. So we have 3 entities, none smeared with partisanship the way this committee often is, tasked with this matter, even with criminal investigation, have completed their review. Then along comes this committee. What it really wants is to do an impeachment. But even its own leadership could not stomach that. So its own leadership pushes it back to what we now have, which is a warmed over version of impeachment that will mean nothing, will go nowhere, will not be seen in the Senate, will fade into history as another example of the stark partisanship of this committee, notwithstanding the facts before it and notwithstanding objective fact finders. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to point out that the issue is not that the IRS intentionally destroyed evidence. It is that the responsible parties at the IRS did not intentionally preserve evidence as they were ordered to do. I yield back.
Before the gentleman yields back, will you yield to me for a moment?
I yield to the chairman.
I think part of the great deal of frustration and exasperation and the what is just fundamentally wrong is that there was evidence in their possession and it was destroyed. We issued a subpoena to Mr. Koskinen. Remember, the IRS will issue tens of thousands of subpoenas and summons on an annual basis. They know how this thing works. They get it. But they're not often on the receiving end of a subpoena. So we issue a subpoena to the IRS. They know they have. Imagine if this had happened to a regular person. Imagine this. Imagine if the IRS sent you a notice and sent you a summons, and you said, you know what, I have it. I have all the information, I have the data, and I'm going to get it to you. Yep, we got it. We got this dragnet out. We're getting every bit of it. And then he said, yeah, you know, we have it. And then they sat for months, and they destroyed it. And then they came back. Imagine if you went back to the IRS and said, you know what, that information, yeah, I had it, and I shredded it. You can't have it anymore. What do you think the IRS would do to you? They would drag you into court, put handcuffs on you, and you'd be in jail, and you probably should be. We're not suggesting that we prosecute Mr. Koskinen criminally, but he has all of the resources, 90,000 employees, billions of dollars at his disposal. He spent $20 million, roughly, 250 attorneys, we were told. And they couldn't find him. They had them and they destroyed them. So the reason the record will always permanently be incomplete is because the IRS commissioner under his watch brought around to be the turnaround person, the one that was going to work hand in glove with Congress, work hand in hand according to the president. They destroyed them. And then they weren't candid about it. They didn't let us know. They let the White House know. They let the Treasury know. But they didn't let the Congress know. So it's put yourself on the other side of it. You would never, ever get away with destroying documents that were under subpoena from the IRS. And so the conclusion about we're talking about 24,000 emails that were destroyed. And then they came and said, well, we have, I can't remember the exact words that Mr. Koskinen used, but they had gone back and they had checked all these. But the Inspector General was able to recover 1,000 of them. So they were there. And still to this date, June 2016, Mr. Koskinen stands by all of those statements, which we know are absolutely false. So I yield back to the gentleman from Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I associate myself with your remarks and would simply add that, you know, this committee has been here on several occasions dealing with actions of other agencies that were inappropriate. And I'd just like to point out that, and this was before my election to Congress, that this committee brought up the Lois Lerner issue, and if the IRS had done what it should have done in regard to protecting the rights of individual citizens, one of whom is a good friend of mine with the Wetumpka Tea Party, who testified in a very emotional testimony before the U.S. Senate, if they had done what they should have done, we would not be here discussing this right now. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman.
Mr. Chairman.
Recognize the gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time to Mr. Cartwright.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Chairman, I acknowledge and understand the frustration and exasperation that you have just expressed. My regret is that you have chosen to vent your frustration and exasperation on this particular man, Mr. Koskinen. And my amendment is to correct the record and to make it clear that the Inspector General, Mr. Russell George, after an extensive investigation, he is essentially the chief prosecutor in this matter, found no evidence that the IRS employees were politically motivated in their creation or use of the inappropriate screening criteria, found no evidence that the IRS and its employees purposely erased tapes in order to conceal responsive emails, found no evidence that the IRS employees involved intended to destroy data on the tapes or the hard drives, found no evidence that any IRS employees had been directed to destroy or hide information from the Congress. These are not my words. These are the words of the Inspector General, the Republican Inspector General who serves as the quasi-prosecutor in this matter, and he concluded that Mr. Koskinen, and I invite the attention of my friend Mr. Jordan from Ohio to the fact that when it is said that Mr. Koskinen was extraordinarily cooperative, those are not Mr. Cartwright's words. Those are the words of Republican Inspector General Russell George, that Mr. Koskinen was extraordinarily cooperative. Now, we're here talking about putting a permanent blot on the service record of Mr. Koskinen, something that will follow him the rest of his career, something that he will be answering questions on the rest of his life. It is a quasi-criminal prosecution that we're up to here, and in something like this, it's something as grave as this to a man's life and career. You ought to have a high standard of proof. It is like a criminal prosecution. And in a criminal case, a prosecutor has to prove his or her charges beyond a reasonable doubt. Here, I don't think I can overemphasize. We have the chief prosecutor who has said there is no evidence. A far, far cry from meeting any reasonable standard of proof, let alone beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's why I have submitted this amendment. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on the amendment and think twice before we besmirch the good name of a hard-working, lifetime public servant. I yield back.
Gentleman from Tennessee, yield back. Gentleman yields back. Any other members wish to be heard on the amendment? Gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A procedural matter to begin with. I do know that the Judiciary Committee, Chairman Bob Goodlatte, has scheduled a hearing examining the allegations of misconduct against IRS Commissioner John Koskinen, Part 2, and that's going to happen June 22nd. So a little part of me says, you know, are we trying to hurry up and hang this guy? We'll have the trial next week. I'm not sure what evidence will be presented before the Judiciary Committee.
If the gentleman will yield.
I will gladly yield.
I'm on the Judiciary Committee, working with Mr. Goodlatte, the chairman. That is to examine the process of how does an impeachment work. It's been 140 years since it's been done.
Right.
It is not the specifics of the case
Well, I'm
as much
sure,
as it is about the process.
reclaiming my time, I'm sure Democratic members at that committee will have an opportunity to raise questions of substance as well as looking at the procedure. And I just think the more evidence is better. And the procedural point I'm trying to make here is that, you know, if we're going to continue to have hearings on this, we should not be taking a vote now to besmirch the gentleman's name. And look, I understand the underpinnings of this. It's a very serious matter. The fact that the IRS, a very powerful agency, targeted particular groups, particularly politically active groups, for harsh treatment and denial of rights because of their political views is obnoxious. And you know, I understand the anger. I mean, whether it was conservative groups or liberal groups that were targeted, that's a heavy, heavy weapon that the government can use against people to stop, to really trample on their rights. And so there's no question about the seriousness of what we're talking about here, and I fully appreciate the gravity of what's at stake. But when we talked about the evidence, you know, the list of people, of groups that were attacked, that's just evidence of who was targeted. There is no real nexus between Mr. Koskinen and the targeting of those groups. There is the question of custody of the emails and communications with respect to what happened. But when you look at his whole body of work, Mr. Koskinen, and he's no favorite of mine, this whole thing was a mess. It was chaotic, and so. But you do look at the man's reputation and what is at stake. And I look at his body of work over his time in service. You know, he came back out of retirement to try to help a struggling agency get right. Over the tenure of his long and distinguished career, Commissioner Koskinen has worked with both Republican and Democrats. He has earned a reputation as a turnaround specialist of sorts, who can salvage the most desperate situations. That's why Mayor John Lindsay, a Republican of New York, chose him to work for him. After a time in the private sector, he also served as President Clinton's technical person, technical czar, when we had the lead up to the Y2K controversy. He later was called up by President George W. Bush's administration to become Freddie Mac's new chairman in the midst of the financial crisis. Those are difficult times. According to President Bush's chief housing finance administrator, and this is a quote, Freddie Mac needed some stronger management, so we selected him and he accepted the job, and we were thankful. Both Inspector General George and Senator Hatch have characterized him as cooperative. And again, Inspector General George came up with the conclusion that there was no evidence to support what we're claiming here today. I don't understand the basis for damaging this man's reputation. I really don't. And trying to take his pension. He has devoted a significant portion of his life to public service. And I got to tell you, this is wrong. This is wrong. And you know, politics is politics. But the querulous and petulant attitude towards public servants that sometimes prevails in today's politics, and especially in this case, is again obnoxious. And I wish we weren't doing this. Look, I know about holding people responsible and accountable, but the evidence is not there to do this to Mr. Koskinen. It is not here. And you know, I know there are further hearings on this matter, and I'm going to support the gentleman's amendment, and I will oppose this because I think it has a chilling effect on people willing to engage in public service when their reputations and their name can be ripped apart for no good reason.
Thank the
Yield
gentleman.
back.
Thank the gentleman. Does any other member wish to be heard on the amendment? Mr. Walker of North Carolina is now recognized.
Just for a minute, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lynch, thank you for your comments, but you mentioned that that there was...
The chair would remind members to not address other members. They can address the chair, but not other members.
Thank you for the reminder, Mr. Chairman. I think we just heard that there was some questioning about the handling of the emails. Even if there is some question on the handling of the emails, I think it's a bit much to use the terminology that Commissioner Koskinen has been extraordinarily cooperative with Congress. I feel like that at the end of the day, the American people are getting hosed on this. If we think about the specific targeting, something that the IRS apologized. In fact, even the President, if I remember correctly, talked about how angry he was about all of this. And to say, there might have been some questioning, even from the perspective of our friends on the other side of the aisle, Mr. Chairman, to say if there's a shred of questioning or if there was even a little bit of incompetence on the part for not managing this properly. This amendment I struggle with, it certainly wouldn't qualify that as extraordinarily cooperative with Congress. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Plaskett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to speak in favor of this amendment. The Chairman's censure resolution is written without regard to Inspector General George's conclusions that he found no evidence, as it's been stated previously, that there was an intentional destroying of information to obstruct Congress, the Department of Justice, or in fact the Inspector General. The facts do not support this. And there's a difference that I think this resolution confuses is two fundamental concepts, lying and mistake. And I think that we are putting the onus on this one individual and destroying one individual for what this committee has found to be the IRS's misdeeds. So putting the misdeeds of an entire agency on the back of this individual, who yes has the responsibility of the agency, but has not shown himself to in fact be someone who has been untruthful to this committee in any way, is something I think that this committee really does not want to do. I can't believe that the chairman really wants to take this committee to that place and this Congress to that place where the calculations and the actions of an entire agency can destroy one individual because they have decided to become a public servant and take on that. Everyone understands that there's a difference in making a mistake and the fact that someone has intentionally not told the truth. And I believe that the censure is a serious tool that should be reserved for grave misconducts as they're written here. But I have not seen the grave misconduct, by definition, to be within the context of what Commissioner Koskinen has in fact stated that he's done. As everyone on this side has stated, I believe that we're really going just too far with respect to an individual. We can't, in fact, reach the IRS. We can, in fact, destroy the IRS and remove the IRS. So we've then decided to target the head, Commissioner Koskinen. And I think that that's entirely what this is about, and that we're making a huge mistake. As my colleague, Mr. Lynch, said, we are going to have an enormous effect on honest individuals who decide to go into agencies that this committee, in fact, says have made mistakes, or this agencies that we know have problems. Why would any individual go and take on any of those agencies knowing that there's a possibility that oversight may decide that they can't get to the agency, so they're going to go to the individual and destroy them instead? Oh my God. I think that we'll end up with subpar secretaries, commissioners, directors of agencies. If they decide to take on anything that's a difficult task, knowing that oversight and this Congress may in fact just go after them if they can't reach the agency, or let's say it, the President himself. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentlewoman. Now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Duncan.
I yield my time to the chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan. I would remind members that it was the President himself who said, quote, "It's inexcusable and Americans have the right to be angry about it," end quote. This was his reaction to the TIGTA report. He said, quote, "Our administration has to make sure that we are working hand in hand with Congress to get this thing fixed," end quote. I think the President was...
If you would yield, I think he said that about IRS, not about the individual.
Yes, about the IRS.
Okay, and
Yes,
that's who we should be going after.
Clearly. But TIGTA did not have access to all the relevant evidence. Lois Lerner's emails were the most important evidence in determining whether the degree of the political targeting. But these emails were destroyed while Mr. Koskinen was the commissioner. So part of my challenge with Mr. Cartwright's amendment is that they're trying to suggest that the Inspector General did some sort of review of Mr. Koskinen's actions as commissioner. This is not right. Ms. Lois Lerner herself refused to testify based on her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. And when people exercise their constitutional rights, we respect that. But it did have an extraordinary effect in our ability to gather and be able to review those emails. So I think it's absurd to include TIGTA's statement that there was no evidence available as proof of IRS's innocence when, under the lack of leadership and management of Mr. Koskinen, that he failed to comply with a subpoena directly contributed to this lack of evidence. And we obviously probably disagree on parts of this, but to suggest that we're accomplishing what the President said to work hand in hand with Congress, a number of us find that to be absolutely not happening and not true. And I would also point to the fact that the GAO issued a report under Mr. Koskinen's watch who said that this political targeting has not been rooted out. It is still, the policies, procedures, changes, they have not been implemented. I'd be fascinated to know if there was a different president and a different party in the White House, how you all would feel if certain groups that you thought were worthy were being targeted. I think a standard should be a standard, and there's a principle here. When you have a duly issued subpoena, you comply with it. When you testify to Congress, you do so truthfully. If you learn additional facts later, you correct the record. And in this case, this did not happen. The situation is getting worse, not better. And with that, I'll yield back to the gentleman from Tennessee.
I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard on this amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman, the ranking member, Mr. Cummings, recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I want to go back to some of the things that Mr. Lynch talked about. There have been a few members, Mr. Chairman, here who said that they weren't here when all of this started. Well, a number of us were here. And, you know, it seems like we forget that all of this started with a employee at IRS who described himself as a conservative Republican. He just self-described, that started all of this targeting, if you will. And it seems as if we're trying to, because it has been clear from the Republican-appointed IG that a lot of the claims that the Republicans were making from the very beginning were not accurate. It seems like we're trying to push a lot of this onto Mr. Koskinen. Again, someone who has come out of retirement and someone who has been trusted by Republicans and Democrats to address very, very difficult issues. You know, Mr. Chairman, we had a meeting back in March, the Justice Department, and, you know, you said that, you know, nobody's looked at cautioning in what he may have done. But I want to I remember, as I recall, during that meeting that you and I and staff, I think a few other members had, I distinctly remember them saying that they had looked at some of the things that he had done. But since my memory, and we don't have a tape recording of it, I can't say exactly what they said, but clearly they didn't find anything that he had done that was improper. But I do want to refer back, Mr. Chairman, to, I talked a little bit earlier about a June 30th, 2015 IG report, which was entered into the record. And I want to just cite and enter into the record the October 23rd, 2015 letter addressed to you and me from the Justice Department.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I just want to quote here where the Justice Department had done its investigation, and it says in part, we found no evidence that any IRS official acted based on political, discriminatory, corrupt, or other inappropriate motives that would support a criminal prosecution. We also found no evidence that any official involved in the handling of the tax-exempt applications of IRS leadership attempted to obstruct justice. It goes on to say, Mr. Chairman, we also carefully, and I'm quoting, we also carefully considered whether any IRS official attempted to obstruct justice with respect to their reporting function to the Congress, the collection and production of documents demanded by the Department and Congress, the delayed disclosure of the consequences of Ms. Lerner's hard drive crash, or the March 2014 erasure of electronic backup tapes. They go on to say that although those backup tapes should have been protected from erasure due to the Department's preservation demand, there is no evidence that any IRS employee intended to conceal the backup tapes from our investigation or realized that erasing them might violate the preservation demand. And again, I just think that when we are going to the lengths that we're going to here to, again, take away somebody's pension and put a negative mark on their record, I just think that the fact that there may be frustration in that the IG did not find that there was certain violations should not necessarily lead to a man who comes before us based on the information he has from his staff, present it to us, and I just think that we've gone far too far. And with that, I'll yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Does any other member wish to speak on the amendment? If none, the question is now on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Cartwright. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is
Ask
not
for a
agreed to.
recorded vote, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. As previously, a roll call vote has been requested. As previously announced, further proceedings on the question will be postponed. Are there any further amendments to the resolution? If none, as previously announced, further proceedings on House Resolution 737 will be postponed. We intend to recess. We have a number of hearings, markups that are happening in other committees. In order to make sure that we have the maximum member participation, we are going to recess and reconvene at 11:45 to hold the vote at that time. Committee stands in recess.
You can give me 5 extra minutes, 11:50.
But you're right. Committee will come to order. Committee will come to order. The question is, I appreciate the patience. I know that we have a lot of markups and other meetings that are happening, but as we left it last, the question is now on the amendment to House Resolution 737, which was previously postponed. The vote will occur on the Cartwright amendment to House Resolution 737. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chaffetz?
No.
Mr. Chaffetz votes no. Mr. Mica? Mr. Turner?
No.
Mr. Turner votes no. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Duncan votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Amash? Mr. Amash votes no. Mr. Gosar? Mr. Desjardins? Mr. Desjardins votes no. Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Farenthold? Mr. Farenthold votes no. Ms. Lummis? Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Meadows? Mr. Meadows votes no. Mr. DeSantis? Mr. DeSantis votes no. Mr. Mulvaney? Mr. Mulvaney votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes no. Mr. Blum? Mr. Blum votes no. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes no. Mr. Russell? Mr. Russell votes no. Mr. Carter? Mr. Carter votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Hurd? Mr. Hurd votes no. Mr. Palmer? Mr. Palmer votes no. Mr. Cummings? Mr. Cummings votes yes. Ms. Maloney? Ms. Maloney votes yes. Ms. Norton? Ms. Norton votes yes. Mr. Clay? Mr. Clay votes yes. Mr. Lynch? Mr. Lynch votes yes. Mr. Cooper? Mr. Cooper votes yes. Mr. Connolly? Mr. Connolly votes yes. Mr. Cartwright? Mr. Cartwright votes yes. Ms. Duckworth? Ms. Duckworth votes yes. Ms. Kelly? Ms. Kelly votes yes. Ms. Lawrence? Ms. Lawrence votes yes. Mr. Liu? Ms. Watson-Coleman? Ms. Watson-Coleman votes yes. Ms. Plaskett? Mr. Desaulniers? Mr. Desaulniers votes yes. Mr. Boyle? Mr. Boyle votes yes. Mr. Welch? Ms. Lujan Grisham? Ms. Lujan Grisham votes yes.
How is Mr. Gosar of Arizona recorded?
Mr. Gosar is not recorded. Mr. Gosar votes no.
Have all members voted? Clerk will report the tally.
On this vote, there are 15 yeas and 21 nays.
The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. The question is now on the adoption and favorably reporting House Resolution 737 as amended to the House of Representatives.
Mr. Chairman,
All those
I have a parliamentary inquiry.
parliamentary inquiry. What is your inquiry?
Mr. Chairman, the question really has to do with what this resolution does and does not do. On May 18th, you said that the resolution requires the forfeiture of Mr. Koskinen's pension, or to quote your words, requires the forfeiture of his pension. And for today's markup of your resolution, you said requires forfeiture of his government pension and any other federal benefits for which he is eligible. That's what the website says now.
What is the parliamentary inquiry?
Is it not true that this resolution merely expresses the sense of the House that he should forfeit his pension, and that this is a resolution? It does not have the force and effect to require the forfeiture of a pension or any other benefits. It never goes to the President. It is the expression of this committee, and if it passes, of the House, and no more than that. Is that not the case? It has no legal force and effect as impeachment, for example, might.
I will have to allow you to seek your own counsel, but as the resolution states, it is the sense of the House, and then you go to the last page, page 4, be required to forfeit. So I will let you interpret that as you will. I think it's crystal clear.
Well,
but
we're claiming my House.
I'm not going to interpret the bill for you.
Well, we're claiming my time, if I may, with a parliamentary inquiry.
We did not yield you time. I asked if you had a parliamentary inquiry.
I have a further parliamentary inquiry. Does the sense of the House require any action by the government of the United States? Yes or no?
And I don't know that that is a parliamentary inquiry. I will let you make that determination. We've had good, vibrant debate on this, and we will continue with the vote. The question is on the adoption and favorably reporting House Resolution 737 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it, and the resolution as amended is ordered favorably reported. Roll call has been requested, and the clerk will take the roll.
Mr. Chaffetz?
Aye.
Mr. Chaffetz votes yes. Mr. Mica? Mr. Turner? Yes. Mr. Turner votes yes. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Duncan votes yes. Mr. Jordan? Yes. Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Wahlberg? Yes. Mr. Wahlberg votes yes. Mr. Amash? Yes. Mr. Amash votes yes. Mr. Gosar? Yes. Mr. Gosar votes yes. Mr. Desjarlais? Yes. Mr. Desjarlais votes yes. Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Gowdy votes yes. Mr. Farenthold? Yes. Mr. Farenthold votes yes. Ms. Lummis? Mr. Massey? Yes. Mr. Massey votes yes. Mr. Meadows? Yes. Mr. Meadows votes yes. Mr. DeSantis? Yes. Mr. DeSantis votes yes. Mr. Mulvaney? Yes. Mr. Mulvaney votes yes. Mr. Buck? Yes. Mr. Buck votes yes. Mr. Walker? Yes. Mr. Walker votes yes. Mr. Blum? Yes. Mr. Blum votes yes. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes yes. Mr. Russell? Yes. Mr. Russell votes yes. Mr. Carter? Yes. Mr. Carter votes yes. Mr. Grothman? Yes. Mr. Grothman votes yes. Mr. Hurd? Yes. Mr. Hurd votes yes. Mr. Palmer? Yes. Mr. Palmer votes yes. Mr. Cummings? Mr. Cummings votes no. Ms. Maloney? No. Ms. Maloney votes no. Ms. Norton? Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Clay? Mr. Clay votes no. Mr. Lynch? Mr. Lynch votes no. Mr. Cooper? Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Connolly? Nay. Mr. Connolly votes no. Mr. Cartwright?
No.
Mr. Cartwright votes no. Ms. Duckworth? Ms. Duckworth votes no. Ms. Kelly? Ms. Kelly votes no. Ms. Lawrence? Ms. Lawrence votes no. Mr. Liu? Ms. Watson-Coleman? Ms. Watson-Coleman votes no. Ms. Plaskett? Mr. Desaulniers? Mr. Desaulniers votes no. Mr. Boyle? Mr. Boyle votes no. Mr. Welch? Ms. Lujan Grisham? Ms. Lujan Grisham votes no.
Have all members voted? The clerk will report the tally.
On this vote, there are 23 yeas and 15 nays.
In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it, and the resolution as amended is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Sorry, we had already called the vote and understood. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection to pursuant to Clause 2L of House Rule 11, members will have 2 days to submit views on the resolution considered today. Ask unanimous consent that the staff be allowed to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the resolution ordered reported today, subject to the approval of the minority. Hearing no objection, so ordered. If there is no further business without objection, the committee stands adjourned.